Okay, so section 6 is going to take us through some additional solving scenarios. So when we look at number 1 in our homework here, we have this scenario that we talked about in section 5 where I only have a b squared. And so when we look back to that screen I had up in class, we are in this scenario of b squared, or an x squared of b squared only. So we're going to isolate the x squared by undoing. We're going to take the square root of both sides, and remember there's always a plus and minus that goes along with that. So the first thing, this is just simple undoing. Subtract 9 from both sides. So I have 3b squared is equal to 54. Divide by 3. We have b squared is equal to 18. We're going to take the square root of both sides. So we have b is equal to plus or minus the square root of 18. Now we have to think back to section 1 and make sure that this square root of 18 is in lowest terms, that it's completely reduced. Well, 18 is 9 times 2. 9's a perfect square. And so b is equal to plus or minus 3 square roots of 2. So that's how we handle something when it is an x squared only. When we have to factor, and if we look at this one, we have an a squared term and an a squared, or an a term. So now that table, we're in this scenario of having an x squared and an x. So we have to set it equal to 0. I don't know why my pen's not working. Set it equal to 0 and solve. So if we come back here, first thing I have to do is move this. So I'm going to add 2 to my constants. So I have 5a squared minus 5a minus 100 is equal to 0. Now the left side is really a section 2 problem. I have to factor. First step of factoring is to take out a common factor. So I can take out a 5. A squared minus a minus 20 equals 0. Now I have AC factoring. What factors of 1 times 20 will equal negative 1? Well, when you list out those factors, they're 4 and 5. I hope you're maybe getting to the point now where you can skip with something that does not have a coefficient right to that step. That is how it factors if you go through our 4-term factoring and our grouping. Now we still have to solve because we have an equation. This constant, I can ignore it because there's a constant is always a constant. That doesn't change. If there were a variable in here, I would have to set that up equal to 0 and solve for that. But since there isn't, I can ditch it. And I'm left with a minus 5 equals 0 or a plus 4 equals 0. A equals 5 or a equals negative 4. So those are my possible 2 answers. Again, remember what we are doing. We are looking at this parabola and it is going to cross the x-axis at 5 and negative 4. So those are important points in our graph and the change of the behavior in our graph. Now, quadratic equation. Quadratic equation, the quadratic formula always works. Factoring doesn't. A quadratic equation is anything of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Notice it's equals 0. Once I have it equal to 0, then I can apply the formula, the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I'm still solving for x when I do this. I am still finding those critical points where it crosses the x-axis. So first, make sure it's equal to 0. So I need to add 6 to both sides. So I have 3x squared minus 9x plus 6 equals 0. I think it's helpful to identify off to the side. A is 3. Now notice it's plus signs up here. So if you want to go ahead and say plus a negative, just to make sure, B is negative 9 and C is 6. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to fill in this formula. This is the opposite of B, not negative B, opposite of B. So I have the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. Now, a couple of places where you can have trouble. One of them is here, so make sure you're doing the opposite of. The other one is here. A negative number squared is always positive no matter what your calculator tells you. And the last one is in this back half because of that negative sign. And if there would happen to be any additional negative signs, you need to be very, very careful with your signs. Then the last thing is your order of operations and being sure that you're careful with those. So the opposite of negative 9 is 9 plus or minus the square root of 81 minus 72, 12 times 6, all divided by 6. Now, radical sign is acting basically like parentheses. I have to do that first. And so I have 9 plus or minus the square root of 9 all over 6. So I have 9 plus or minus 3 over 6. Now the plus or minus is where I'm going to get my two answers. So now I have to figure that out. I have 9 plus 3 divided by 6, or I have 9 minus 3 divided by 6. 12 over 6 is 2. 6 over 6 is 1. If these come out nice and neat like that, that means that this could have been factored. When you get the fractions, they don't factor as nice, or if you end up with something that doesn't work, i.e. you get a negative under here, so it doesn't factor, there's no solution, you can see why this is a more useful formula.